The clock in the mansion's large room said midnight, and Julia was still sitting in the huge velvet armchair, staring into space. His thoughts flowed like a tumultuous river, carrying with them fragments of broken dreams, empty promises, and a feeling of betrayal that burned in his soul. There, in that imposing house, luxury mixed with despair, and the golden walls hid dark secrets that threatened to consume her. Leonardo Vasconcelos, Julia's husband, was the type of man that everyone admired and feared. With a fortune built on million-dollar deals and a presence that filled any environment, he was the portrait of absolute power. But behind the facade of the perfect husband and successful businessman, there was a calculating man capable of anything to satisfy his desires. And Julia was about to find out in the cruelest way how far this power could go. Everything began to change when Lydia, Julia's younger sister, arrived to live with them. Lydia was just a young girl of 22, full of life and dreams, still trying to find her place in the world. Julia had welcomed her with open arms, believing that her sister's presence would bring a little lightness to her suffocating life with Leonardo. But she had no idea that Letitia's arrival would open the door to a devastating betrayal. For the first few months, everything seemed normal. Leonardo, with his seductive manner and gaze that always seemed to know more than others, seemed kind and attentive to Lydia, but Julia didn't suspect anything. She was used to Leonardo's charm, a charm that had once seduced her and that now served as a mask to hide his true nature. Lydia, in turn, seemed enchanted by the grandeur of the mansion and the luxurious life it offered, without realizing the danger that was hiding there. But then the signs began, little things that, isolated, might seem innocent, but that, together, formed a disturbing puzzle. Julia noticed how Leonardo's eyes lingered too long on Lydia, how the casual touches became more frequent, how the whispers and laughter shared between them echoed like stabs in Julia's heart. She tried to push these thoughts away, telling herself that she was just imagining things, that the stress and loneliness were taking a toll on her mind. Until, on a cold August night, the truth ruthlessly revealed itself. Julia woke up from a nightmare with her heart racing and realized that Leonardo was not next to her in bed. Instinct made her stand up, her bare feet touching the icy floor as she walked down the dark hallway. It was then that he heard a sound coming from the guest room, where Lydia was staying. She approached with her heart in her throat, and what she saw when she opened the half-open door made her lose her feet. There they were, Leonardo and Lydia, intertwined, as if the world around them did not exist. The sight was like a blade piercing her chest, cutting off Julia's breath. The man she loved, who had promised to protect and respect her, was there, betraying her in the most vile way possible with his own sister. Lydia, who had always been her confidant, now became an accomplice in a betrayal that Julia could never have imagined. The scream caught in Julia's throat, but the tears came down, hot and bitter. She turned around, staggering away from that scene, feeling like she was falling into an endless abyss. The pain of betrayal was mixed with the despair of knowing that, in that house, Leonardo was the owner of everything, including his destiny. How could she fight a man who had the world at his feet, and who was now destroying what little was left of her soul? The city lights shone in the distance, but Julia could only see the darkness that now consumed her heart. Trembling, she ran back to her room, closing the door with desperate care, as if she could stop reality from catching up with her. Every beat of her heart echoed like a drum in her head, hammering home the truth. She had been betrayed by the man who swore to love her and by the sister who once believed to be her safe haven. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Julia tried to contain her tears, but the crying came in waves that shook her body. She hugged herself, trying to protect herself from the cold coming from inside. Everything seemed unreal, as if it were a nightmare from which she would wake up at any moment. But the pain was real. It was unbearable. She felt like she was falling apart, piece by piece, as she tried to understand how everything had gotten to this point. Leonardo had always been an imposing presence in his life. Since they were married, he has enveloped her in a world of luxury, but also control. Julia hadn't noticed right away how Leonardo's claws were slowly closing around her, limiting her choices, suffocating her freedom, until she no longer knew who she was without him. And now, with her sister Lydia involved in this betrayal plot, Julia felt more vulnerable than ever. The sound of firm footsteps in the hallway made her catch her breath. Leonardo was coming back. The doorknob turned slowly, and he entered the room, his blue eyes cold and calculating, without a trace of guilt or regret. He closed the door behind him, watching Julia with a look that made her feel small, as if he could see even the most hidden corners of her mind. "Are you awake?" he asked, voice so soft it sounded almost cruel. He took a step forward, but Julia instinctively backed away, pressing her back against the headboard. Leonardo stopped, a cold smile curving his lips. "What's wrong, my love? You look scared." She wanted to scream, to confront him, but the strength that the betrayal had taken from her left her paralyzed. She looked at him, trying to find some trace of the man she once loved, but all she saw was the predator's mask. A man who knew he had control over her, and who reveled in her fear. "You," she began, but her voice was weak, broken. Leonardo tilted his head, as if enjoying her pain. Julia felt anger boiling inside her, a timid but growing flame. "I know what you did," she whispered finally, the words coming out as a silent accusation. For a moment, Leonardo's smile faltered, but he soon recovered it, giving a short laugh. "Ah, so you think you know?" He approached, his steps heavy on the wooden floor, until he was mere inches from her. Julia felt the threatening energy he exuded, every muscle in his body tense. "Be careful with the accusations, darling," he murmured. "They can put you in a very dangerous position." The threat hung in the air, suffocating any response Julia could give. Leonardo raised a hand and touched her face, but she flinched, which only seemed to amuse him even more. "You don't understand, do you? Everything here, everything around you, is mine." He dropped his hand and turned, leaving the room with the same menacing calm with which he had entered. When the door closed, Julia felt tears burning her face again. But now, something new was beginning to sprout inside her, something that betrayal had not been able to completely destroy: the will to fight. She didn't know how, she didn't know if she had the strength, but she knew she could no longer be that man's silent prisoner. For the first time in a long time, Julia felt that she needed to find a way to escape, to get her life back. That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, he spent hours thinking about how to survive in a world where even the people closest to him could be his enemies. What she didn't yet know was that Leonardo's game of power and manipulation was just beginning, and that the fight for her freedom would require more courage than she had ever imagined. The first rays of sunlight invaded Julia's room, bathing her in a cold light that did not warm her broken heart. She hadn't slept a wink all night, her mind spinning around the betrayal she had witnessed and Leonardo's subtle threats. The pain was still there, throbbing, but now it was starting to mix with something else: determination. She needed to get out of that situation. He needed to regain control of his life. Julia knew that facing Leonardo would not be easy. He was a powerful, influential man, and no one would dare turn against him. Even her family, who had always admired him, would probably turn against her if she tried to expose what he had done. But the betrayal with Lydia, that was a wound she didn't know how to heal. Her own sister, someone she had cared for and protected since childhood, was now part of Leonardo's plot of destruction. The day dragged on, with Julia moving around the house like a shadow, her eyes empty, her body heavy with tiredness and pain. Leonardo acted as if nothing had happened, as if their marriage was a perfect fairy tale. He made a point of showing off alongside her, smiling at the employees, maintaining the appearance of a dedicated man. Every time he approached or touched her, she felt a shiver of repulsion, but she swallowed the feeling, waiting for the right moment to act. That afternoon, as the sun burned the horizon with shades of orange and red, Lydia entered the kitchen, where Julia was sitting, staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold. Her sister had a hesitant, almost guilty look, but Julia didn't know if it was remorse or fear of being discovered. "Julia," Lydia began, her voice low. She approached slowly, as if walking on broken glass. "Are you well?" Julia looked up, staring at her sister with a mixture of pain and disbelief. How could Lucia ask that? How could he care about her condition? After everything he had done, Julia felt a lump form in her throat, but she held back the tears with all her strength. He wouldn't give Letitia the pleasure of seeing his weakness. "I'm fine," Julia replied, her voice steady, though her shaking hand belied her strength. "Why wouldn't I be?" Letitia bit her lip, a gesture that used to be innocent, but now seemed full of falsehood. She got closer, trying to touch Julia's shoulder, but Julia backed away, which left Letitia pale. I'm sorry if I did something to hurt you," Letitia murmured, looking away. Julia's anger exploded at once. She stood up so quickly that the chair almost fell, making Letitia take a step back, scared. "Did you do something to hurt me?" Julia repeated, her voice trembling, full of emotion. "You slept with my husband. You destroyed everything, Letitia. All." Letitia remained silent, her eyes teary, but she didn't say anything. Maybe there were no excuses she could make, and maybe she knew her words would be useless. Her silence only made Julia's pain grow, turning into a current of anger that made her tremble. But before Julia could say anything else, Leonardo's cold presence invaded the room. He entered the kitchen, eyes calculating, as if assessing the situation with pleasure. "What's going on here?" he asked, and his voice was soft but threatening, like poison hidden in honey. He approached, placing himself between the two, like a mediator who actually wanted to increase the conflict. "I'm just having a conversation with my sister," Julia replied, trying to remain calm. But Leonardo smiled, that smile that made his skin crawl. "Careful, darling," he whispered, just so Julia could hear. "You don't want to lose what little you have left." The threat was clear, and Julia felt her resolve waver for a moment. But then, with a courage she didn't even know she had, she lifted her chin. "You can have everything you bought with your money, Leonardo," she said, her voice firm. "But I still have my dignity, and you will not steal that from me." Leonardo's eyes flashed with something dangerous, but he didn't respond. He just walked away, taking Letitia with him, as if he had won another battle. Julia, on the other hand, knew that the war was just beginning. She needed to prepare herself. She needed to find a way to escape that hell before Leonardo completely destroyed what was left of her life. And, above all, she needed to find out if she could still trust anyone, or if she was really alone in this battle for her freedom. That night, the darkness felt heavier than ever. Julia locked herself in her room, her thoughts running like an uncontrolled gale. Every second that passed in the mansion made the air feel more suffocating, as if the walls were slowly closing in around him. Leonardo, with his oppressive presence and absolute control, had become more than a cruel husband. He was her jailer, manipulating everything and everyone to keep Julia under his power. She knew she needed to act, but she had no one to turn to. Her family, trapped by Leonardo's lies and the glitter of his fortune, would never believe her. And Letitia, her sister's betrayal, was a blow that she still didn't know how to process. How could someone so close, someone she had trusted and cared for, become an accomplice to her tormentor? Sitting on the bed, Julia felt the weight of loneliness. But then, a thought began to form, a spark of hope that she clung to with all her strength. Perhaps, if she could prove Leonardo's betrayal, if she could expose the truth, she would find a way to escape. But how? He was smart, careful, and every corner of that house seemed to be under his surveillance. The sound of low laughter coming from downstairs brought Julia back to reality. She slowly stood up and approached the door, peering through the gap. There he was in the main hall, talking to Letitia. The sight of them together made her feel like a knife was being twisted in her chest. But she also noticed something she hadn't seen before, the way Letitia avoided Leonardo's gaze, as if she were uncomfortable, maybe even scared. For a moment, a doubt arose in Julia's mind. Could it be that Letitia, despite everything, was also trapped in that game of manipulation? Did Leonardo control her in the same way, or did she participate willingly? Uncertainty gnawed at Julia, but she couldn't afford to trust anyone, not yet. You needed to protect yourself first. The next day, Julia decided that she needed to leave the house, even if it was for a few hours. She needed air, space, clarity. Disguising her growing panic, she went downstairs and found Leonardo in the office, organizing documents. He looked at her with that air of superiority that made her stomach turn. "I need to go downtown," Julia announced, trying to keep her voice steady. "I want to buy some things." Leonardo looked up, assessing her for a moment. She knew he was used to controlling her every move, but surprisingly, he nodded. "Sure," he said with a fake smile. "I'll ask one of the drivers to accompany you." Julia forced herself to smile back, even though her heart was panicking. She knew that the driver would be another one of Leonardo's eyes. But maybe, just maybe, she would find an opening. He put on a coat and went out, feeling the cold wind on his face like a breath of temporary freedom. In the car, the driver, a man named Carlos, remained silent as he took her to the city center. Upon arrival, Julia tried to look casual as she walked into a busy bookstore. Inside, the buzz of conversation and the smell of new paper were a welcome relief. Feigning interest in some books, she turned away from the entrance and took a deep breath. I needed to think. There wasn't much time before Carlos started to get suspicious. It was then that he noticed a middle-aged woman sitting in a cafe inside the bookstore, typing on a laptop. She was a well-known lawyer in the city, famous for her work with women victims of domestic violence. Julia hesitated for a moment, fear freezing her intentions. But the memory of Leonardo and Letitia together, of all the times he manipulated and threatened her, gave him courage. She approached the table, her knees almost giving out with nervousness. "Excuse me," said Julia, her voice shaking. The lawyer looked up, surprised to see such an elegant and visibly distressed woman standing before her. I need help," Julia continued, feeling the tears begin to well up. "My name is Julia Vasconcelos, and my husband, he's a dangerous man." The lawyer became serious, closing the laptop and indicating for Julia to sit down. "Tell me everything," she said, and for the first time in a long time, Julia felt that maybe there was hope. Even if small, even if fragile, it was a fighting chance. She began to speak, the words coming out in an uncontrollable stream as the lawyer listened intently. Julia knew that she was still far from escaping the hell she was living in, but at that moment, when telling her story, she realized that she was no longer completely alone. Julia's breathing shook as she poured out the torrent of words, each sentence filled with accumulated fear and pain. The lawyer, a woman named Helena Castro, listened with an attention that seemed almost tangible, her eyes serious and determined. When Julia finally finished, feeling drained, Helena paused, processing everything. "You were brave to come to me," Helena said, her voice firm and gentle. "But we need to be careful. If your husband is as powerful as you described, any wrong move could put you in even greater danger." Julia nodded, despair mixing with the small spark of hope that had been born inside her. "I just want my freedom," she whispered. "I want to get out of this life before he destroys me completely." Helena took a sheet of paper and started writing down some instructions. "I'm going to contact some colleagues who can help ensure your safety. I'm also going to need you to start documenting everything. The threats, the abusive behaviors, any evidence that could be used to legally protect you." The idea of documenting the horrors she faced daily seemed overwhelming, but Julia knew it was necessary. "And my sister?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Letitia, I don't know if I can trust her. I don't know if she's trapped in Leonardo's manipulation or if she's part of all this on purpose." Helena sighed, realizing the complexity of the situation. "For now, focus on you," he said. "Saving other people is important, but you need to be safe before you try to help others. And if Letitia really is involved, you'll need to be strong to deal with it." Before they could continue the conversation, Julia's phone vibrated with a message from Carlos, the driver. "Do you need to go back?" Helena asked, seeing Julia's worried expression. Julia looked at her cell phone, feeling the panic return. "Yes, he's waiting for me. Leonardo never allows me to be alone for long." She stood up, but Helena gently held her arm. "I will see to it that you have a secure channel of communication with me," said Helena. "And remember, never underestimate a man who feels threatened. He may try to manipulate the situation to his advantage, but you are stronger than you know. Julia thanked him with a look of gratitude before leaving the bookstore and walking back to the car, trying to control the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. When she got into the vehicle, Carlos observed her in the rearview mirror, as if trying to assess her state of mind. "Is everything okay, Miss Julia?" he asked, but she just nodded with a forced smile. As the car headed back to the mansion, Julia knew she was playing a dangerous game, a game of life and death. But now she had an ally, someone who believed her story, and that was more than she had had in a long time. Upon arriving home, Julia entered carefully, feeling the weight of Leonardo's presence even before seeing him. He was in the office, but she could hear his voice echoing, probably on a business call. The house seemed to breathe the oppression he brought, and Julia felt her body tense. But before she could go up the stairs, Letitia appeared at the kitchen door, her face tired and her eyes red. "Julia," she whispered, and the vulnerability in her sister's voice caught her off guard. We need to talk." Julia hesitated, her heart divided between anger and compassion. Letitia looked scared, as if she were carrying a burden too heavy for her own strength. Julia took a deep breath, fighting to remain calm. "What do you want to tell me?" he asked, his voice filled with conflicting emotions. Letitia looked around, making sure no one was around before approaching. "It's about Leonardo," she said, her voice shaking. "There are things you don't know, things that can destroy you, or save you." Julia's world stopped for a moment. Were Letitia's words a ray of hope, or just another piece of Leonardo's web of manipulations? She didn't know, but one thing was certain. The game was becoming even more dangerous, and the truth seemed further away than ever. Julia faced Letitia, feeling the tension growing between them like a rope about to break. Her sister's words were cryptic, but the fear in her eyes seemed sincere, almost desperate. Julia felt a mixture of anger and concern, not knowing whether to open up or protect herself even more. "What things, Letitia?" Julia asked, her voice low, but carrying an intensity that Letitia herself had never heard before. "Do you realize what you did to me?" Tears threatened to come, but Julia blinked quickly, trying to maintain control. Letitia lowered her head, her shoulders shaking slightly. I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. "But you don't understand what Leonardo is capable of doing. He manipulated me, Julia. He threatened me, made promises, played on my insecurities until I no longer knew what was real or what I wanted." Letitia's words fell like stones in Julia's chest. It was difficult to believe in her sister's innocence after everything she had seen, but she also knew Leonardo's power of manipulation. He was a master of turning weakness into advantage, of twisting reality until people surrendered to his rule. But even so, betrayal was a wound that could not be healed with words. "Then why did you stay?" Julia questioned, pain mixed with a need to understand. "Why did you stay here, knowing what he was doing to me? With us?" Letitia swallowed hard, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Because I was trapped too," she admitted, and her voice sounded broken. "Stuck in the idea that he could protect me, that he was my only chance to, to survive. I was scared, Julia. He threatened to destroy our family, expose secrets, take everything we had. She stopped, breathing heavily, and Julia realized for the first time how fragile her sister was. Perhaps Letitia was not as complicit as she seemed. Perhaps she was yet another victim of Leonardo, caught in his web of lies and manipulations. But still, the pain didn't lessen. Before Julia could respond, the sound of loud footsteps echoed through the corridor. They both froze, and Letitia took a step back, her face contorting in fear. Leonardo appeared at the entrance to the room, his sharp gaze passing from one sister to the other, as if he could feel the charged atmosphere that hung in the air. "Is everything okay here?" he asked with a tone that seemed gentle, but that Julia knew hid an underlying threat. Her stomach dropped, but she forced a smile. "Yes," Julia replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "We were just talking." She could feel Leonardo's gaze piercing her soul, as if he was trying to decipher her thoughts. He approached Letitia, and the simple movement made Julia catch her breath. Leonardo placed his hand on her sister's shoulder, and Letitia tensed like a thread about to snap. "That's good," he said, the smile frozen on his face. "I hope you two are getting along well." Julia felt anger burning in her veins. How dare he? How could he continue playing with them, even knowing the destruction he had caused? But she held herself back, swallowing the urge to scream, to explode with everything. It wasn't time. Not yet. "Yes, we are," Letitia replied, her voice barely audible. Leonardo watched her for a few more seconds, then let go of her shoulder and turned to leave, but not before giving Julia one last warning look. When he disappeared down the hall, Letitia broke down in silent tears. Julia watched her, her heart divided. She didn't know if she could trust her sister, but she also knew that if she wanted to beat Leonardo, she would need all the information she could get. He approached Letitia, hesitant but determined. "If you want my help, Letitia," Julia said, her voice firm, "you're going to have to tell me everything. From the beginning." Without hiding anything, Letitia looked up, her eyes still wet, but now with a spark of hope, or perhaps regret. "I'll tell you," she promised. "But you need to know that what he did is worse than you imagine." The air around them seemed to freeze, and Julia felt a chill run down her spine. What else could Leonardo have hidden? And, more importantly, how would she survive when the whole truth finally comes out? Julia sat next to Letitia, the weight of the latest revelations still hanging on her shoulders like a storm about to break. Letitia's hands were shaking, and she took a few seconds to catch her breath, wiping the tears from her face before starting to speak. "I didn't know at first," Letitia began, her voice hoarse with emotion. "When I came here, Leonardo treated me like a father, someone protective, almost too affectionate. I thought it was strange, but I convinced myself that it was just an exaggerated way of taking care of the family." She paused, staring at the floor. "But things started to change. He isolated me, just like he did you. He started planting ideas in my head, convincing me that I needed him, that I depended on him." Julia felt her heart sink when she heard this, remembering how Leonardo had done the same to her, slowly undermining her self-confidence until she felt lost, without her own identity. Letitia continued, her voice wavering. "He threatened me, Julia," he confessed with a lump in his throat. "He said that if I didn't obey, or if I tried to tell you anything, he would destroy our family. He would ruin the lives of everyone we love." I felt so weak, so scared, that I did things that I never thought I would do. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing. "But I never wanted to hurt you." Julia's heart ached, torn between anger and compassion. The emotional scars were still there, open, but perhaps Letitia wasn't just an accomplice. Perhaps she too had been a victim, just like herself. "So why are you telling me this now?" Julia asked, with a glimmer of hope that this conversation could be the start of something bigger. Letitia looked at her, her eyes full of determination. "Because he's planning something worse," she revealed, her voice shaking. "I heard Leonardo talking on the phone last night. He's getting ready to get rid of you, once and for all. He thinks you're becoming a threat, that you could expose his secrets, and he won't let that happen." Julia's blood ran cold. Letitia's words echoed in her mind, each syllable falling like stones upon her newfound hope. Leonardo was willing to go to any lengths to keep his empire of power and control intact. But now, more than ever, Julia knew she needed to act. "I needed to escape before it was too late." "We need a plan," Julia said, trying to control her panic. "Something he doesn't see coming." Letitia nodded, but before she could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway again. This time, it was Leonardo, his menacing presence approaching. The sisters exchanged a look, and Letitia's expression quickly closed, as if she were wearing a mask of submission. Julia did the same, swallowing the fear that pulsed inside her. Leonardo entered the room, his eyes narrowing when he saw the two together. "I hope you're getting along," he said, his tone soft but full of authority. "You know how much I value harmony in this house." Julia forced a smile, her face painfully tense. "Yes, darling," she replied. But inside, despair mixed with a new flame. The will to fight, to survive, and to defeat the man who had stolen so much from her. Julia knew that time was running out. With each passing day, Leonardo's control seemed to tighten even more. and the veiled threats became more constant. She and Letitia could barely exchange glances without the feeling that they were under surveillance. Leonardo seemed omnipresent, as if the house itself had eyes and ears at his service. But that night, when the house finally fell into the tense silence of dawn, Julia and Letitia gathered in the old attic. It was the only place where they believed they could talk without being overheard. The shadows of the old boxes and dusty furniture seemed to move, as if they held the mansion's deepest secrets. Letitia was pale, but her eyes now had a gleam of resolution. "I thought of something," Julia whispered, her eyes full of a plan that was slowly forming. "If we want to escape, we need to expose Leonardo before he can stop us." She pulled from her pocket a small recorder that she had found among her father's old belongings. "If we can capture a confession, something that reveals who he really is, we have a chance to escape and get help." Letitia hesitated, her voice breaking. "But he is careful. He never talks directly about his plans. He always uses words that can be interpreted in different ways. And if he suspects that we are trying this, he will not forgive us." Julia knew that Letitia was right, but it was a risk they needed to take. The fear and panic that Leonardo had planted in them was beginning to give way to fierce determination. Julia was tired of being a victim, tired of living in fear, and now, with Letitia by her side, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she had a chance to win. "We need to find the right moment," Julia said, her voice low but firm. "Something that makes him lose control, that forces him to reveal himself." Letitia nodded slowly, although her eyes were filled with uncertainty. "What if we don't make it?" she asked. "What if it makes everything worse?" Julia held her sister's hand, the touch a mix of forgiveness and solidarity. "Then at least we'll know we tried, that we fight." The next morning, the plan began to be put into practice. Julia and Letitia went back to acting as if they were resigning themselves to Leonardo's rule, pretending that everything was normal. Leonardo seemed satisfied, believing his control was intact. But what he didn't know was that a storm was brewing, silent and relentless. That night, during a seemingly ordinary dinner, Julia left the recorder hidden in a small decorative box next to the dining table. Leonardo, always suspicious, didn't seem to have understood anything. He stood at the center of the table, exuding power and authority, as he talked about business and future plans, as if their life was a perfect fairy tale. "You really think you have everything under control, don't you?" Julia asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but with a touch of teasing. Leonardo looked up, surprised by her tone. Letitia tensed, but Julia continued, knowing that she needed to bring him to the point of explosion. "Do you think you will never be exposed? That no one will ever know what you do behind these walls?" Leonardo set down the cutlery, the sound echoing in the silence of the room. A cold smile formed on his lips. "Are you implying something, dear?" He leaned forward, his eyes flashing with a threat that Julia knew all too well. "Do you really think someone would dare to face me? That anyone would believe you? After everything I've built?" Julia's heart was beating so hard that she feared the sound would betray her, but she remained calm. "What you have built is an illusion, Leonardo," she said, fear mixed with courage. "And illusions always crumble." Leonardo gave a short laugh, but there was tension on his face. He stood up, his chair scraping the marble floor, and walked over to Julia. She felt her body freeze as he approached, the smell of his expensive perfume mixing with the invisible threat he always carried. "Be careful with your words, Julia," he whispered, his face close to hers. "You have no idea what you are challenging." But that's exactly what she wanted, to force him to reveal himself, to show the truth she knew was hidden beneath that perfect facade. The recorder was capturing everything, every venomous word, every disguised threat. And that night, while Leonardo slept in the next room, Julia and Letitia listened to the recording, their eyes widening as the truth unfolded. Was it enough? They didn't know, but it was a start, a spark of hope in the midst of darkness. Continues. Get ready for the climax and outcome in the next chapters. You said, continue, ChatGPT said. In the silent dawn, Julia and Letitia met once again in the attic, the recorder between them. reproducing Leonardo's threats in a metallic whisper. His words, which echoed through the recording, were venomous, filled with superiority and the promise of destruction if anyone tried to challenge him. Julia held the device with trembling hands, feeling hope and fear mix in a whirlwind inside her. "We have what we need," Letitia said, her voice low, but Julia saw the doubt in her sister's eyes. It was a risky step, one that could both free them and seal their fate. The risk was enormous, but there was no turning back. They needed to act, and the only option was to face Leonardo head-on. "And now?" Letitia asked, her voice wavering. Julia knew that this was the question that would define everything. He looked at the recorder and then at Letitia, feeling a knot of emotion and responsibility. They were in this together, and whatever the outcome, they would need to stick together. "We need allies," Julia finally replied. "Someone who has the strength to face Leonardo. Someone who can protect us as we move this forward." He thought about the lawyer Helena, the only person who seemed to really understand what they were going through. But how to reach her without Leonardo getting suspicious? The answer came faster than Julia expected. The next morning, while Leonardo was in the office dealing with important business, Julia pretended to have a migraine attack. He, suspicious, watched as she took the medicine she pretended to swallow. When he finally got busy again, she and Letitia jumped at the chance. "You need to get out of here," Letitia whispered, helping Julia get ready. "I'll distract Leonardo if he asks for you." The plan was risky, but Julia had no choice. He went down the stairs at the back of the mansion, his heart racing, feeling every shadow as a sign of danger. He left through the garden, getting into the car that Letitia had prepared, and drove as fast as he could to Helena's office. When she arrived, the lawyer's face lit up with surprise to see her enter so urgently. "Julia," Helena asked, getting up from the table. But before she could say anything else, Julia placed the recorder in front of her. "I need your help," Julia pleaded, the words coming out like an avalanche of emotions. "I got this. It's proof of what he does, of the threats. But we need protection. We need to get out of this situation now." Helena took the recorder and listened to Leonardo's threats with her face hardening. The lawyer knew that this was dangerous, but she also knew that she could not ignore the seriousness of the situation. "I'll do what I can," Helena said, firmly. "But this will require quick action. I will contact the police and make sure you and Letitia have protection. You need to be ready to get out of there as soon as we have the necessary support." Julia felt a wave of relief mixed with fear. It was a risk, but they were finally doing something concrete. Helena started making calls, and Julia, sitting on the sofa in the office, felt tears rolling down her face. It was the first time in years that he felt there was a chance to escape. But what she didn't know was that the clock was ticking against them. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Leonardo was already beginning to realize that something was wrong. Letitia did her best to keep him distracted, but his gaze grew more suspicious by the second. He was not a man who liked to be challenged, and Julia's absence soon aroused his anger. Letitia's phone rang, and she answered it with shaking hands. "It was Helena. You have to leave now," Helena said. "Protection is on the way, but we need you to be ready to escape." Letitia hung up the phone, fear suffocating her. But there was no more time to hesitate. They needed to face fate, risk everything to free themselves. The mansion's clock showed noon, but the air was charged as if a storm was about to break. Letitia could feel the cold sweat running down the back of her neck as she tried to act naturally. But Leonardo was no longer easily fooled. He noticed the uneasiness in the young woman's gestures, and her gaze, as penetrating as a blade, began to tighten in distrust. "Is Julia still locked in her room?" Leonardo asked, eyes narrowing as he approached Letitia. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. If Leonardo realized what was happening before Helena and the protection arrived, everything would be lost. "Yes," Letitia replied, her voice trying not to betray her panic. She said the migraine got worse, but before he could continue, the sound of a car entering the front gate echoed in the entrance, and Leonardo turned his head sharply towards the window. Letitia felt her heart stop for a moment. "Who was here?" Leonardo muttered, teeth clenched. He started to walk towards the entrance, but Letitia grabbed his arm, desperately trying to slow him down. "Wait, Leonardo," she said, her voice coming out louder than she intended. I need to talk to you." He stopped, turning to face her with a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "What is it now, Letitia?" he asked, but his eyes were already filled with suspicion. He knew something was happening, something that was beyond the control he had always had over their lives. Meanwhile, outside, Julia got out of Helena's car with her heart beating like a drum. Helena was at her side, and 2 police officers got out of the other vehicle. "It's okay," Helena said, trying to reassure her. "Let's go in and resolve this once and for all." Julia took a deep breath, her hands shaking, but now with a strength that came from a place she didn't even know existed. She had survived years of manipulation, abuse, and betrayal, and now was the time to face it all head-on. Leaving her fear aside, she entered the main door, feeling the ground beneath her feet like a stage where the final scene was about to take place. Leonardo was in the middle of the lobby, Letitia still at his side, eyes wide as they saw Julia enter accompanied by the police. For a moment, Leonardo's face was petrified, but soon a mask of anger formed. He took a step forward, the menacing presence rising like a wave. "What is that?" Leonardo roared, his voice filled with fury. "Did you bring strangers to my house, Julia? Have you completely lost track?" Julia felt fear pulsing through her veins, but she didn't let it paralyze her. "It's not just your house anymore," she said, her voice firmer than she imagined. "You kept me here for too long, Leonardo. But it's over. We know what you did." The officers stepped forward, and one of them began reciting Leonardo's legal rights while another officer held out a hand to stop him. Leonardo tried to free himself, but the force of his threats seemed to have finally encountered a greater obstacle. "You think you can take me down like that?" Leonardo shouted, his eyes sparkling. "I am Leonardo Vasconcelos. I control this city. I control everything." But his words now echoed without the same power as before. Julia realized that he was no longer the invincible giant he always seemed to be. For the first time, she saw the man behind the mask, fragile, desperate, and out of control. Letitia looked at everything with tears streaming down her face, as if the weight of years of fear were finally lifting from her shoulders. She moved away from Leonardo, going to Julia's side, and the two hugged, pain and relief mixed in a moment that seemed to last forever. "You can't do that!" Leonardo screamed again, but the police took him away, his words lost in the void. Julia and Letitia watched, feeling the air around them become lighter, as if they could finally breathe again. Helena approached, placing her hand on Julia's shoulder. "You did it," said the lawyer. "You too did it." Julia looked at her sister, her face still marked by pain, but with a new light in her eyes. The battle hadn't been easy, and the scars would still remain, but now they were free. Free to start over, to rebuild their lives, and to never let anyone destroy them again. And as the sun began to set, bathing the mansion in golden light, Julia knew that this was the beginning of a new story, one in which she could finally be the author of her own destiny. If this story also gave you courage and hope, please leave your opinion. Share in the comments and give a thumbs up to help this message reach more people. Please share, and if you want to continue our journey, subscribe to the channel. Now, just like the freedom we choose, you too can tell your own story.